Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are back today and talking about old world transplants and revivals. Very specifically, we're going to be talking about two topics within this umbrella. First, we're going to talk about klezmer music, followed by traditional Irish American music. But first, klezmer music. Let me go ahead and share my lecture notes with you all so that you have an idea of where I'm headed for today's lecture. As always, our focus is going to be on music, but in order to give music some context, we're going to have to approach this from a number of sort of historical perspectives, cultural perspectives, and talk about, where the group of American Jews have traveled over time and their connection to the rich history of klezmer music. So let's start by talking about American Jews first off. So American Jews or Jewish Americans are Americans who are Jews, of course, whether by religion, ethnicity, or nationality. So we have three identifying categories for Jewish Americans. And the current Jewish community in the United States consists primarily of, and I'm going to take this slow, Ashkenazi Jews. They're descended from the diaspora of Jewish populations from Central and Eastern Europe. So this group comprised of about 90% of the American Jewish population, which is huge. Depending on the religious definitions and varying population data, the United States has either the largest or the second largest Jewish community in the world after only Israel. So in 2012, which is a little bit old of a data point at this juncture, the American Jewish population was estimated to be between 5.5 and 8 million people. That's a lot of people, which constitutes for the US population between 1.7% and 2.6% of the US population. So of that population, the areas that are most concentrated with Jewish Americans are some major metropolitan areas. New York City, where we happen to be located, is one of them. Los Angeles is another, and Miami is the third. Those three areas alone contain 25% of the entire Jewish population of the entire world. So Jewish migration. Jewish migration to the United States increased really dramatically in the early 1800s. Why? Well, persecution and economic difficulties in parts of Eastern Europe were, I think, the two most, or the two largest contributing factors to the increase of immigration. Most of these new immigrants were Yiddish speaking. They were mostly also from a rather poor diaspora concentrated in communities within the Russian Empire. Modern day Poland and Ukraine are kind of the big two standouts there. So during this same period, a great number of Jews who also arrived from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who had a very large concentration of urban Jews, driven out mainly, again, for economic reasons. And we're going to see time and time again that economic reasons are going to be a major impetus for creating change and driving migration and immigration patterns. So many Jews also, just to enrich our areas in which we are traveling, are also going to be immigrating from Romania. So over 2 million Jews landed between the late 19th century and 1924, when the Immigration Act of 1924 was hugely restrictive in terms of allowing immigrants to pass into the US. Most of them ended up settling in New York. That was the first point of landing, and really established it as the world, one of the world's major concentrations of Jewish population. American Jews have been really disproportionately successful in a number of fields for a number of years. And the Jewish community has gone from a lower class minority when it was originally, taking the drive to immigrate to the US, to a much more middle and upper class group. Studies, just to throw a couple numbers out there, and upwards of 80% of the manual factory laborers prior to World War I, and the majority of fields buried them were Jewish Americans. And to the richest or second richest ethnicity in the, they have constituted the richest or second richest ethnicity in America for the past 40 years, which is also a major upswing in terms of their original class position. That comes in terms of like average salary. There's also a huge concentration of Jews in the academic field, and other fields of higher education. So just some really interesting kind of facts about the history of American Jews, where they're coming from, some of the challenges they faced, and why immigration was sort of spurred. So this is sort of the first area here, upper left-hand corner of my lecture notes. So in 1990, the National Jewish Population Survey showed that only 5% of American Jews consider being Jewish solely on being a member of a religious group. So when I started out this discussion, I talked about Jewish Americans being tied to this identity through religion, ethnicity, or nationality. And this is kind of much more perhaps diverse label than some of the other ones that we will encounter later on in our semester. The vast majority of American Jews consider themselves members of an ethnic group or a cultural group or a nationality, and or to all of those. So again, a very multifaceted label here. And, one of the, especially for me, being a composer and a conductor, one of the most interesting things to me about American Jews, the Jewish culture in general, is going to be Klezmer music. And there's a very interesting history of where Klezmer music has come from, what makes Klezmer music identifiable as Klezmer music. And, again, that's going to be our focus today. So I know I rambled a bunch of facts and data at you. I just want to give us some context as to the group of American Jews and how they interact with the rich tradition of Klezmer music, because they are the ones that have mostly perpetuated certainly have been the ones that have been perpetuating this rich musical tradition. So what is klezmer music? Well, klezmer music is instrumental dance and party music. So obviously we're going to have a great time talking about this. So it's very specifically instrumental dance and party music of the Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi, I have a really hard time with that word, Jews of Eastern Europe. So for those of you who don't know about the Yiddish language is a dialect of German with some Hebrew words. So it itself is an interesting conglomeration of two different language points. It's commonly spoken among Jews of Central and Eastern Europe before the Holocaust. Originally, klezmer referred to the instrumental music, but later was used to extend further and talk about the musicians themselves. So today, klezmer is an even farther reaching term. It refers to traditional music and of Jews and its extensions. So it's significantly more encompassing. In order to understand what's happening in the music, we're going to rely on the 4 big areas that I outlined at the very beginning of the term. We're going to want to pay attention to texture, how many independent ongoing things are happening at one time. We're going to want to know what's happening with the meter or the rhythm of what we're listening to. We want to know about the instrumentation, what timbral qualities are specific to this music. We're going to also want to know about the harmony and what tonal or quasi-tonal or modal language is happening within the context of the piece. And like fifth, sorry, I left this one out of my count, form and function, structure, what's happening in terms of repeating ideas. So these big 5 elements are what we are going to sort of always come back to in terms of trying to figure out what's going on in the music. So probably what's most identifiable about klezmer music is the instrumentation and how the harmonic language interacts with the instrumentation in addition to the form and the structure of the piece. So instrumentations, what the instruments that we're listening to are going to be the things that pop out to us first. So the most important melody instruments for klezmer are usually the violin and the clarinet. Why? They have the ability to mimic the human voice. Flute is somewhat less common, and saxophone is used as an alternative, but again, doesn't happen all the time. We're looking for a melody instrument that really is able to mimic the sound of the human voice. That melody is then anchored by an accompaniment. And those accompanimental instruments have changed over time. Originally, we had a cymbalum. The cymbalum is a instrument that's really quite lovely to listen to. It's a stringed instrument that you play with a hammer. I'll play you an example of all of these instruments used in the context of klezmer music, of course. But that instrument, was phased out at some point, favoring a louder accompanimental instrument like the piano or the accordion. Occasionally, we also have additional instruments that add to the accompaniment. Those could be the string bass, for example, or the tuba. There are a couple other instrumental culprits that often pop up in a klezmer group. Those instruments are brass oriented, especially later on when we are favoring louder music. So trumpet and trombone occasionally make an appearance. And sometimes the rhythm section is filled out with further percussion instruments, such as woodblock or snare drum. Before the advent of recording technology, klezmer was a completely oral tradition, meaning that the musicians were mostly were in charge of passing down the music, and therefore we're going to have structures that are somewhat repetitive and easy to memorize, because this is a tradition that is not necessarily always written down, but passed down from musician to musician within playing ensembles. So let's talk about why the melody occurs in these instruments that mimic the human voice. And the reason that is because the tradition of the cantor is huge within the Jewish community. And a cantor is someone who sings in a very florid and melismatic style. And rather than continue to explain it in the blind, why don't I go ahead and play you an example of this melismatic singing style. Give me 1 second to pull that up.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
Great. So very dynamic and riveting performance. What we first heard is a slight drone in the background, which often happens for within hearing a cantor. That drone gives the performer a bit of an anchor harmonically in order to accurately use the modes that are tied to this part of the religious service. So let me go ahead and pull my lecture notes back up. So when I'm talking about these modes, the mode that's used most often sounds to us in terms of a Western classical canon context like the Phrygian mode. There are, to reiterate, and I know I've gone over this before, in music, there are, at least within the Western classical canon, there are, or rather musicologists and theorists talk about 7 particular modes. The modes that are most often used in music, popular music, music of the classical era, the Romantic era, and some of the early 20th century, we'll talk about the 20th 21st century, perhaps later, use the major or the minor mode, the Ionian or the Aeolian mode, right? So the Phrygian mode is something that we don't often come across in the Western classical canon and has a particularly distinct sound to our ears. It has a raised third in it, and it's a prayer mode that's heard in the piece that we just listened to, and it's often used within klezmer music. So this is what I have over here. It's a mode if we're talking about intervallic steps, E to F half step, F to G sharp. That's interesting because we have that raised third there that happens, that G sharp. That's our particular note of color that gives klezmer music that very distinct sound when we're talking about harmony. The other thing that we heard was this obvious importance put on the voice, and even the instruments that were accompanying the voice were doing so in the exact same part, where those flourishes and ornamentations and embellishments were not precisely timed with one another, but created this sort of slightly chaotic energy, something that's incredibly beautiful and captivating to listen to within this tradition, most certainly. So this kind of free form is, and again, we're talking then about structure, is something that we hear as being one of the essential essences of klezmer music, and that is ornamentation, this idea of embellishment, which really does give the music its very klezmer quality. And it's that embellishment that not just staying on one note, ba, but like decorating, ba la la la, and giving it some motion and some drive to it. So we'll wrap up this segment talking about one more klezmer example. We're going to hear the this structure at play. Why don't I go ahead and have us listen to it first, and then we'll dissect it. Let me go ahead and take a moment to pull it up.